Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on reducing suckler calf mortality, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Amy Fawcett. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Sophia Hepple, who is a Government Veterinary Advisor in Animal Welfare at the Animal Plant and Health Agency. Sophia has also undertaken a Nuffield Scholarship sponsored by AHDB Beef and Lamb, and her findings on this will form the basis of her talk this evening. So we have over 80 people registered for the webinar this evening. I'd like to thank Elena very much, who is working behind the scenes to keep everything going technically. If anybody does have a sound problem, please just type it into your box on the right-hand side of the screen so that we know you're having issues, and we'll resolve those for you. So the plan of action this evening is that Sophia will give a presentation, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. You guys will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anybody does think of a question halfway through, again, just type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll pick those up and we'll come back to them at the end. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Sophia.
Hi, please accept my apologies. I'm a Virgin webinar presenter, and therefore if I make any mistakes, I apologise in advance. I do want to thank AHDB Beef and Lamb. I was the first funded Nuffield farming scholar by the Beef and Lamb Group. Obviously there had been previous scholars funded, I think with Dairy Co and on the pig side, but this will be, I'm the first Nuffield scholar and kind of feel under pressure to have done a good job. So I hope you enjoy the presentation, you don't fall asleep over your cup of coffee or your pint of beer. So I've got some key themes and key messages, and tonight we're focusing on relationships. Now, I apologise, this is not any type of marriage guidance counselling session, but we are going to be looking at relationships between the farmer, the family and business partners and the advisors as part of reducing calf mortality. We're going to look obviously at the cow and the calf, and the cows and the calves. Look at the environment and your record keeping, and then putting it all together and making some practical sense of it all. There is a focus on colostrum provision in this webinar. If you want to read my full report, there's quite a lot of topics covered, so I've had to pick and choose what we do. Now, the farmers I went to visit, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where I went to see the farmers, as far away as New Zealand and Australia and Colombia, because actually I got very similar responses from farmers. And you'll find throughout this presentation that there's quite a lot of quotes from farmers, because I learnt very rapidly that farmers prefer to hear from other farmers, not vets like me, and therefore I'm trying to encourage this by actually feeding back comments from other farmers across the world and their experiences. But what came through quite clearly was that it wasn't just what was happening on the ground and what you were doing with the calves that really affected calf mortality. It went right back to how you were running your business, how farmers were running their business from the get-go, and that some key relationships were very important in actually carrying out certain processes and possibly introducing change when change was necessary. And I think for quite a lot of the farmers I interviewed, some of them found it quite hard to adapt to change. Others embraced it, particularly those that could use anything that involved an app as well. Others, if they could involve their dogs, and therefore you can see we had a wide range of farmers engaged and interviewed across the piece, but some of their responses were quite similar. It'd be interesting to look at that. One of the first things, and you might think, well, yeah, I've focused on the vet-farmer relationship because I'm a vet, and maybe that is right, but I think when I was first trying to get farmers engaged and interviewed in this project and understand what they were doing within their business, there was a huge range of contrasting opinions on how beef farmers use their vets. Now, if I'd gone to dairy farmers, there would be probably a much more narrow focus on the range of uses used, but we had a massive range in use, and I'll go into a bit of that later on. It wasn't particularly influenced by country or location, or for example, the degree of development of a country. I guess with Serbia having some catching up to do, and Colombia having its own particular issues with FARC, separatist movements, and essentially civil war going on for many years up until recently. That there was very much an individual opinion on the role of the vet-farmer relationship. But what was very clear was that one-off experiences could influence a lifelong opinion on the value of a vet to their business. So what I'm saying here is that if there was a bad experience, that a vet had advised a farmer to do something and they'd done it and it had gone wrong, this inevitably resulted in a loss of faith in that vet-farmer relationship. I think once you've got an established vet-farmer relationship, you understand that sometimes things go wrong and things can't be sorted, or what's recommended doesn't suit your farming business. But I think when you're in the early stages of developing an advisory role, and it doesn't have to be a vet with a farm, it can be another specialist agricultural advisor, a one-off experience does influence then your opinion to take things on. One of these examples was in business decisions around the use of bull versus artificial insemination and embryo transfer. And I don't know about most of you dialed in, but certainly the feedback I got from I would say across the piece, so that it didn't matter whether it was New Zealand or Australia or Ireland or Colombia, is that most people were using bull only, or they were using 1 or 2 cycles of AI followed by a bull, and there were a limited number involved in doing any embryo transfer, and a very small number doing AI only. But just like using the vet, it was actually one-off bad experiences with either artificial insemination and or embryo transfer that influenced decisions on future use. So there's this genuine, if AI worked the first time round or the first couple of years it was going well, then farmers were introducing it more into their routine business process. And certainly in areas like Colombia, they were actually getting investment and funding and being provided with embryo transfer and subsidised artificial insemination to try and encourage improving the genetics across both beef and dairy sectors. But these one-off bad experiences did influence future farmer decision making, and I think this is one area where we could potentially look at improving things with regards to decision making, because to be honest, now I'm coming down, it's time for an honesty test. This is a prime specimen that was presented to me at one of the farms I went to. This was in Colombia. Every bull that's bought or brought in to your farm poses a biosecurity risk to your herd, and investment in high health status and tested disease-free is a given in this day and age. We all know we must be testing any bull that, well, any animal, but particularly bulls that come into our herds. But how many of you, hand on your heart, have bought a bull based solely on a trusted recommendation, a whim, possibly because you saw a bull and liked the look of it, or because you purchased one from there before and you hadn't had any problems? Disease does not respect pedigree status or mate rates or doing a special deal. And I think one of the examples I gave later on about one of our case studies about the type of diseases that were brought in and then the consequential impacts on calf mortality, I hope will make you think honestly about decision making. If all 100% of you dialed into and in on this webinar have never bought something without considering its disease status, or you have considered its disease status but still bought it, then possibly I'm talking to the wrong people. I don't know, but there we go. So how much do you use, value and trust your vet or veterinary practice? Are you reactive or proactive, or do you actually have a non-existent use of veterinary services? And from the stuff I did in the Globe, and I will say that some of the reactions were, I've done this all my life, I don't need a vet, they don't know what they're talking about, to somebody that's valued them quite a lot and used them quite a lot. They are there to give you expert advice. They're not just there to sell you drugs and vaccines that you can't get off the shelf at your local ag merchant. But good vets are not those that hand over antimicrobials without question when you ask them to. I know it's a quick fix and it's easy. If you've got a vet, you can phone up and say, look, can you just give me a bottle of this or that? But we now have to be very much focused on an evidence-based veterinary medicine. The advice you get from a vet should be tailored to your farm needs, not a generic beef farm, because you all know that you're quite different and the issues you have are quite different. The vets themselves have to recognise their own limitations or their own practice limitations, the veterinary practice, and they should also actively seek specialist input when required. I would certainly be suspicious of any vet that professed to be an absolute expert in everything. And so when we look at management changes to beef businesses, and for example, if we come on later to recommending changes around what you do with calves or what you do with purchase of bulls or use of AI, as can be expected, decision making is principally focused within the single person or business partners making a decision, or if they're family business partners consulting together before making decisions. So most of the decision making around sometimes fairly major business changes, advice isn't necessarily sought from the experts. Those that I would suggest were making the most out of both vets and specialist advisors. There's an example here that I've got up on the screen. Always employ someone better than yourself, as it's the only way to get smarter. Ensure you have as many knowledgeable people in your immediate circle. And I think it's accepting that you don't always know all of the answers, and you might be really good at the area of farming in which you work. But there are advantages in getting advice, and you don't have to take that advice, but it's always helpful to get as much advice beforehand before you make those decisions. Family and business partners are quite tricky, and when I interviewed farmers across the globe about barriers to introducing changes, how they wanted to make changes to how they were breeding their animals, family impacts and business partners had a significant impact on this. We know that each business is unique and that relationship dynamics, that critical issues within the farm affect decision making, but the most I'd say the most successful farm businesses that I came across, and those that were actively growing their business and trying to manage issues around, for example, calf mortality, other issues across the animal health sector. They had regular minuted business meetings. This was essential to them doing things properly. Clear responsibilities and actions, particularly within the family, and particularly when you're looking at succession planning and different people taking on different roles within the farm. And regular staff meetings to explain and translate decisions and change into practical reality. So if you were deciding to make a change based on any advice that you were getting, you had to cover that off with all of the family and business partners, and you had to have everybody on board. And then also translating it, if you were employing staff, again, make it very clear what the rules are and what you're expecting them to do within that change. So how to recognise a good vet, or how to recognise when a vet may be good for your business. Good vets question how you manage your farm. They visit your farm, and I know that's an odd thing to say, but I'm very aware that many of you may have had advice from vets that have never visited your farm. And they might challenge you and or your business partners in what you're doing. Sometimes they might advise you that you may not be as right as you think you are, like your spousal partner saying that you're wrong. You're not necessarily going to appreciate it at the time, but hopefully there's enough respect between you that you acknowledge the advice you're getting. The other thing that's important to recognise is that solutions are rarely instantaneous. If you're having a massive mortality outbreak with your calves, it's not necessarily going to be resolvable instantly. Quite often you need investigations and further secondary discussion. You might need laboratory work done, and actually consultation with disease experts when we get some weird aberrations in disease. So although we have an expectation for certain disease like rotavirus or E. coli or IBR to follow a particular route, sometimes it doesn't, and we need to seek further advice. And that sometimes does cost you money, or sometimes it costs the vet making that extra effort to go away and find out these things for you and actually getting some extra specialist advice for you. So my advice is change vets if they're not providing a good service. Loyalty is not good business sense. It's helpful in the relationships that you have with your advisors, but if you are not getting a good service, change. And obviously mutual respect and trust is key. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of the specialist advisor in how it's affected the business and improving the beef business and improving survival of the calves and the number that are getting to finishing getting them to a stage of finishing and getting them marketed as rapidly as possible, or in the way that they want to meet the end user's requirements. So in Tasmania, Australia, there's a particular farmer who had not recognised the value of some of the advice he was getting, probably using his vets in a non-proactive manner. He was certainly using his agronomist regularly, his accountant, and making good use of his wife's secretarial skills. But it was only when he sent his daughter to vet school that he realised what a breadth of learning that she had, and actually how integral she was to the business. And he probably went from having contact with his vet maybe every month or every couple of months to being in contact with his daughter, who's now an integral part of that business, maybe every other day, to discuss not just decisions around animal health and animal welfare, but also decisions around the way the business is going, and recognising that there is value in getting that extra expert advice. Another example, in Colombia, following the return of parts of the country to farmers, there's quite a lot that was taken over during the FARC takeover, and when farmers got their farms back, to be honest, most of them were quite happy just to get their farms back and start farming again, and the animals that were left alive then rebuilding those farms. But this particular farmer, who had 8 farms across a number of areas, had recognised that he was having real problems with his enterprise. Now, Colombia is a bit of an odd one. This particular, we can have areas which are completely dairy, areas which are almost wholly beef, but there's quite a lot of areas that are using animals in a dual purpose manner. So they're using animals to produce beef, but also they're taking milk off those animals as well. So genuine dual purpose approach. And one of the key problems with the farms was massive mortality, well over 15 to 20% mortality in calves. And although this was a drought area, they did have control over water sources and feed. And what the farmer decided to do was to employ a vet to take over 2 of the farms. He obviously was testing out the vet. He's not took him on across all 8 farms. He wanted to see how he'd do over just 2 of the farms. And one of the main things that the vet found is that, first of all, he had to get in a really good manager. And the guy on the right that you see there is the manager he brought in, setting up lots of standard operating procedures and protocols that staff had to follow. And one of the main problems that they found was lack of staff engagement, staff not doing what they were told. And the only solution on this farm was actually to sack those farm workers who were not willing to take the appropriate actions on hygiene, calving actions around milking and reducing mastitis for those animals that they were milking. And across the board, it was about engaging staff that were committed to change and actually introducing approaches to management at calving time and colostrum provision in a way that to those people who are being employed to do it, they just weren't interested in. And so you then had to employ people that would be willing to basically do as they were being told to do in their job. The other big thing where there was quite a difference across all beef farmers was keeping records. Obviously, those that have got an interest in supplying pedigree animals for various sectors were required to record a lot more. But generally, most people were only recording what were the minimum legal requirements, or the minimum legal requirements plus whatever assurance scheme they belonged to or pedigree scheme requirements were required, whatever the customer was demanding. There was a very small number of farmers who actually kept records because they felt they were important and there would be a value in decision making. And the farmer comment here, which is a New Zealand farmer originally from Ireland, goes into quite a lot of detail about how he doesn't really feel that his farming clients, farming customers, both on the dairy side particularly, but also on the beef side, actually appreciated the work that he was doing to produce the best bulls for the job. And I think this is probably one of the areas where more could be done to develop, looking at the easy calving breeds, looking at those that have got obvious good temperament traits, and we're seeing those coming through now through the EBVs, but we do need farmers to respond to that and actually go for those type of bulls with these EBVs, not just the cheapest bull or the biggest bull you've got and then wondering why on earth you have problems at calving. So there's a big range amongst the farmers I interviewed regarding how they valued records, and I think probably what needs to change and probably would help you is actually recognizing that some of the things that you record are useful to you, and it may well be that the records you're keeping they're not easily presented to you, so you have lots of requirements around births and deaths and movements, and there's a lot of stuff on the cattle tracing system that in theory could give you lots of information, and this is what I can look at and give readouts on. And actually, if we can make it more user-friendly for you and actually be able to provide this data in a more user-friendly, as it's done with some of the projects that have been going on in Ireland, with a very much customer-focused outputs on the records that you're putting in and then getting outcomes back. The only issue is that the outcomes that come from your record keeping are only as good as the records that you put in. So if you're a bit lackadaisical and not recording the records, recording all the requirements quite correctly, then obviously the outcomes that you get are not actually going to reflect true life and how it really is. So it is really about valuing those records, but there's probably also a role there for those people that are demanding all of these things from you, all of these people that are demanding records. There does need to be some feedback to you and some value to you, and I think this is an area again we could improve. Calving records is something that came out quite clearly, apart from those that kept all of their calving records in their head. Even with fairly small numbers, I think if you've got a quite tight calving pattern as far as your suckler beef are concerned, sometimes you do forget which one had that difficult calving. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you start getting past 80 to 100 suckler cows, then I think you sometimes may be struggling to remember which one had the dodgy calving 2 years ago if you're not keeping these records. Now, there may be minimum legal requirements or assurance scheme requirements or really pedigree scheme requirements especially, but it's only really when assistance is being given, it's not necessarily seen as a value in itself. You're keeping the calving records. Certainly my experience from interviewing the Irish farmers who had to keep a record of everything associated with calving and ease of calving, it wasn't necessarily seen as a value in itself. And the ease of calving was always associated with the dam. So part of the driver behind this was looking at genetics and really checking that the type of genetics work that was being done, or that is being done in Ireland, to improve the ease of calving, for example, but is only ever associated with the dam. And therefore, if we wanted to look at what was happening to the calf and how we could improve survival of the calf, then this was going to be a real problem for kind of making changes and making improvements in calf survival. Ease of calving is an essential trait for those expected to have minimum supervision, and I would suggest that some of the countries I visited, the amount of supervision they had at calving probably wouldn't align with either European rules or our own national rules on how often you should be checking on your animals. But ease of calving across the board, it doesn't matter whether you're checking them twice a day or once a week. You can still miss problem calvings if you're not there all the time or have some way of watching over them. So when we look at the impact of a calving event on a calf, it's not always recognised at the time, and we see these coming through our labs all of the time. This is not an unusual event, and it's not just an issue around dairy calves. We see it quite frequently with beef calves coming through the labs on post-mortem. So you get a calf, it's sick and it dies at 3 to 4 weeks old, or maybe even older. And the farmer can't understand it. It was a big calf, it was doing well, it was feeding well from the dam. And so thinks he should maybe get it post-mortemed. So therefore it goes for post-mortem. So you've got to remember that you know, as well as me, that you don't get everything post-mortemed. You usually get something post-mortemed when you think something out of the usual has happened. Post-mortem reveals extensive multiple healing rib fractures. They're not the cause of death, though, but it does jog the memory, and the farmer remembers this was the big calf that needed a bit of extra pulling. Took a while to get going with the dam, but once he started sucking, he was well away. And actually what it comes down to is that there's a lack of colostral antibodies due to failure to start sucking in the first few hours of life. A disease challenge subsequently led to overwhelming infection and then death. So any irregular procedure or event at calving can have consequences for the calf, however irrelevant it seems to be at the time. And therefore one area of record keeping that I certainly found from the travels that I went on is that those that were fully on the ball with recording these incidents, however irrelevant they seemed, were more likely to, I guess, notice when those particular calves had problems and then follow up on them when they started having problems. As I've mentioned a few slides ago, supervision at calving, there was a huge variation. Some were bringing in their beef suckler cows to calve, and then having issues that we see, just as we see with bringing our ewes in for lambing, issues around mismothering, issues around hygiene, etc. And then we had others that were maybe once a week. Certainly older cows were just being checked once a week and being left out and forgotten. So all of these quotes in parentheses are actual quotes from farmers. This is what they were telling me. Clearly, the more you supervise calving, the more likely you're going to see when problems occur, and will increase the chances of getting a live calf every time. But I was challenged by a number of peer reviewers when I wrote my report, which is available on the International Nuffield website. You can search for my report through that and look at some of the case studies. And I was challenged significantly by a number of people, including Nuffield, saying, well, we think you've got this wrong. Surely this is all to do with geography. You're referring to those people in New Zealand, for example, that have got 8,000 hectares. And of course, they're not going to get out to see their calves or see their cows calving and see the problems that they're getting at calving. But no, some boys' toys are actually useful. So some of the most dedicated and committed farmers were those with the most horrendous terrain, but they certainly made use of drones. Now, I don't know whether the buying of such drones was a deliberate intent to improve cow welfare and calf welfare at the time of calving in monitoring them. But certainly this is one of the main uses of this particular drone, not only for monitoring groups of animals and the amount of grass they're eating and making decisions around whether to move them or not, but also specifically for monitoring where the cows and calves are. Is there a calf missing? And this was definitely not influenced by bad terrain, because there were ways of getting around supervising calving even when you couldn't be there. And from the point of view of the UK, I guess we do have areas where it's difficult to get to, particularly if we're calving outdoors on difficult terrain. But there are opportunities to supervise that better, just as we have opportunities when we bring them indoors. So what about the temperament and attitude of the dam? Cow temperament was the key reason for no or limited intervention at calving time. So what a lot of farmers are saying, we don't do anything at calving because we can't get near the cow. But actually, if you look at the research, it tells us that defensiveness around calving has no relation on mothering ability. So the fact that a cow that's just given birth attacks you doesn't actually tell us that she's actually going to bring up her calf better, or that that calf is going to survive. There's absolutely no relation between defensiveness around calving and mothering ability in rearing a calf to weaning age. Now, the only caveat to that, I would say, is that defensiveness is useful where we've got key predators. So in Colombia, where we're dealing with jaguars, there might be value in having a kind of defensive aggressive dam, but it's certainly, at the moment, we're not thinking of reintroducing wolves back into Scotland or England or Wales. We've not got any key predators that would require a dam to be defensive. Now, only 4 farmers that I interviewed in detail actually kept temperament attitude records in the true sense of the word, in that right from the point of birth and any management point, they would make a note against that particular animal as to whether they've been a problem, you know, whether getting them through races, when they were treating them, when they were TB testing them or whatever. And they absolutely believe there's a critical requirement of the beef cow. And basically, if it was 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes, then you're out. And this is before the heifer even got to the point of having a calf. The other key thing that's come out, both from discussion with farmers, but also the research evidence, is that human handling during rearing phase as a heifer is key to improvement in temperament. So whilst there are genetic influences on the temperament of an animal, and I'm sure you'll all have experience yourselves if you've had kids, that you can have some laid-back kids and some angry kids, and it's exactly the same with calves and with heifers and cows. But you need to do that influence early on. Once you get to their finishing stage or adult, you can't influence that environmental effect on influencing their temperament and their response to a human. So your beef suckler cows should recognise you as being mostly a bringer of positive influences. They shouldn't be giving birth and getting reactive and being defensive towards you. And I think the answer on that one really, as far as those farmers that absolutely believed in temperament and attitude records, was that if you have these type of cows, you shouldn't be keeping them. If I just move on to colostrum provision now, and I know we're talking about reducing mortality, and you probably expected me to get on colostrum provision much sooner, but there are lots more influences, as you've already seen, on how calf mortality can be affected, including down to whether you're using AI and keeping a completely closed herd, or introducing bulls that then introduce disease because you've not disease tested them. So most calves did not need supplementary colostrum, and I think all of you would agree with that. Most calves being born to a beef cow don't need supplementary colostrum. Most farmers also recognise the need to get colostrum into the calf as quickly as possible. So this diagram to the left here shows that we can't really use averages because of the distribution of timing. But if we take a median, which is similar to an average, but it's the most frequently occurring response that I got from farmers, was that essentially they were getting colostrum into calves that needed it within 2 hours. And the range, I would say that the range that's telling us there, when it says that the3rd quartile is 3.25, it means that 75% of farmers were getting colostrum into those calves within 3.25 hours, which is well within the risk period when we're looking at how long you leave calves before you get colostrum into them. But the key take home was that most were not giving enough. There's details of this in the main report, and if I give any advice, it's following the dairy 1, 2, 3, which I think is an Irish or Northern Irish approach. Always use first drawn colostrum, always give it within 2 hours, and give 3 litres, and then possibly repeat feed within the next 6 to 12 hours. This advice that we give the dairy farmers is exactly the same. So when to give colostrum, knowing that we don't have the same issue with beef as we do in dairy. So all farmers agreed in the majority of cases no supplementary colostrum needs to be given to beef calves. There is no clear evidence of poor colostrum quality in beef cows, unlike in dairy types. So you may well be aware there's quite a lot of work been done on colostrum in dairy cows, and we do see evidence of poor quality colostrum. There's also been associations with heifers, first and second time calvers. This has not been shown to be the case in beef animals. So heifers are not an issue with respect to the immunoglobulin and antibody content of the colostrum itself. It should be fine. But just remember that colostrum is not a magic cure-all. And I think one of the things I certainly found was that there were a lot more farmers bringing their cows in to calve to supervise them, avoid indoors for closer supervision at calving time, absolute need to ensure hygiene in the calving shed, because it doesn't matter how much colostrum you're giving those calves to protect the calf. If they get an overwhelming dose of an infectious organism like E. coli, and particularly the nasty ones, the K99, rotavirus, cryptosporidia, coccidiosis, any of these, if it's a big enough dose, then okay, the colostrum helps a bit, but it's not going to protect them completely. Colostrum is not a cure-all. It doesn't protect animals 100%. And so if you're not getting it right around calving time, when you've made a decision to bring them indoors, then this is where you can get into real difficulties with high mortality rates in your calves. And just remember that housing can bring benefits, but don't forget the risks. So how do you identify your high-risk calves and have a clearly defined protocol? Basically, any calving intervention where the calf is not seen to respond immediately to the cow and get sucking. So all of the examples you're given here, apart from the calf rejection issue, is about the calves not getting up and sucking within that magic 2 hours. The other situation is late night calvings where you're not going to be around and you're not able to monitor whether they're going to get the colostrum within those 2 hours. And really it's a practical decision around providing supplementary colostrum because you're not going to be there to check whether it's taken it. The other issue is calf rejection, and that's why I brought the heifer issue in. Twins, caesareans, heifers, all of these are more likely to result in calf rejection. So the calf is seeking to suck, but they get rebutted and they only get a few sucks. So it's not just important to check that the calf is sucking, it's also checking that the animal is accepting the calf. And the examples of twin caesareans and new heifers are those that are more likely to result in calf rejection. So again, these need more close supervision, and actually not only are the calves sucking, but are they sucking for a reasonable length of time. So when, what and how to give colostrum, and this has caused so much controversy amongst, I think, vets and farmers. First of all, have a clear standing operating protocol for your staff. So give guidance on timing, volumes, hygiene and procedure, and don't ever assume knowledge in the staff that work for you, whatever their age and whatever their experience, whether they're 16-year-olds or whether they're 85. Everybody's got an opinion. So what you need to do is have a clearly established protocol for colostrum supplements and check that they're doing it. And I think certainly our experience on the dairy side of the industry is that you can have a procedure and have it defined for staff. But if you are employing staff to do things for you or family members, do check that they're doing what you're telling them to do. This is one of the things that's caused the biggest controversies, bottle or stomach tube. It actually takes longer, but I think overall a bottle with a teat is preferable. First of all, it stimulates the correct suck reflex and allows the correct flow of milk into the right part of the stomach. It avoids the risk of oropharyngeal injury, so basically where you've jabbed the tube down the esophagus, and we can end up with injuries within the mouth, at the back of the throat, and down the esophagus. And the other thing significant around oropharyngeal injury, it's a bit like the one with pulling the calf out and breaking its ribs and not getting going. And the calf recovers from having broken ribs, but that impact on it takes a little while to come through. So we don't always see the impact of an oropharyngeal injury. It can come some time down the line, so it's not going to happen the next day. It could be several days or even a week after that you have problems. It also reduces the risk of inhalation pneumonia. So use a tube when a calf is completely flat and unable to suck. Only do if competent to do so. And I think even losing a single calf to a tube misplacement or incorrect use is probably one calf too many. You should be able to do it correctly. Most farmers have reported that where tubing was necessary rather than by choice, the prognosis for the calf was generally poor. Now, I think because I would say that the jury's been out, I think, and farmers have been influenced by, I guess, local communities and their vets as to whether they use a tube or whether they use a bottle and getting the calf to suck. Generally, if you end up using a tube, your calf is more likely to die anyway, but that's not necessarily because you've tubed them wrong. It's just that if you are tubing them, you should only really be tubing them when they're in a poor state and not able to suck. Colostrum type options and risks. Maternal colostrum was by far, despite a lot of farmers saying they wouldn't want to go near certain beef cows at any time, and certainly wouldn't want to be trying to take colostrum off them. The majority did take maternal colostrum when it was required and when they needed to supplement calves. And then next on the list was purchased colostrum replacer, and then dairy colostrum source, and then from their own herd would be another option. So would be off another cow who had spare first draw colostrum. The risks obviously with getting colostrum from a dairy, you really need to ensure that you've got a pasteurised dairy source, and there's quite a lot of dairies that pasteurise their colostrum now. Pasteurisers are good investments for dairies. So certainly when you're thinking about things like Uni's disease and other disease risks, always go for pasteurised colostrum source if you're getting it from a dairy, and ideally from an animal that's been vaccinated against rotavirus and E. coli prior to calving, so the Rotovec or equivalent. On that point, if you are opting to bring your beef cows in for calving, considering the use of the Rotovec vaccine, because rotavirus and E. coli and all of the problems that we associate with, I guess, dairy calves rather than beef calves, these do become an issue in a confined environment when you've got a bunch of beef cows with their calves suckling. These diseases have become more prominent, and we're seeing them a lot more, as well as seeing an increase in some of the respiratory diseases that if they're out calving outdoors and not going through that process of being brought in to calve, we're not always seeing that problem. Weight records in calves, generally not being done that much. If it is done at all, it's done at birth and then done at weaning. And this is fairly commonplace across the board. There were some people that were weighing really regularly and weighing, possibly too much. But this is an area where we've raised it as an issue with rearing dairy calves. Monitoring calf growth by eye, sometimes you can miss problems with calves. And by the time you realise that your calves aren't growing at the same rate as the other calves within the same birth cohort or within the same month of calving, then it may be too late. So regular weighing of calves, and again, if we come back to temperament and management and managing your calves, if you're rearing your own beef suckler replacements, regular handling, regular weighing, regular interventions, doing things with them where you're not actually sticking a needle in them, is always quite good for actually improving temperament and handling of those animals, because actually generally weighing is not stressful for calves. You can bring them in, weigh them, let them go, and you're not sticking things into them and making them hurt. It does also improve their understanding of the human-cow relationship. And a little bit more on bigger data. Whatever you do, be careful with it. And I presented this at the Nuffield Farming Conference. Bigger data is really useful, but you need to understand the data as it relates to your farm. So if we look at age at first calving, if we take a range of age of first calving and interviews, if you don't know that we're dealing with two different types of cow type, Bos indicus or Bos taurus. So the Bos taurus will be the type of cows we have, the beef and dairy types we have in Europe, and the Bos indicus will be the type of cattle that you'll see in South America and in South Africa, for example. Then actually you can get a skewed view of figures. So be very careful, not only with statistics that people spout out at you, whether it's your vet or your ag advisor or something maybe that industry bodies are giving out. Always understand what's sitting behind it and what data is feeding into it. And one of the things I found with the colostrum feeding is that where we found that farmers were giving repeat feeds of colostrum, so if you heard earlier, I said that farmers didn't always recognise that they needed to give more colostrum, and ideally 3 litres within the first 2 hours. What this complicated graph on colostrum feeds is telling me is that those that were only ever opting to do a once-only colostrum feed were more likely to give a single large dose in one go. Those that were giving the smaller doses were those that were more likely to give more frequent feeds of colostrum. And actually, if they were going to give them 3 lots of 1.5 litres over a 12-hour period, probably that was going to be sufficient for those calves. Even though we weren't hitting 3 litres in 2 hours, they were hitting 4.5 litres in 12 hours, for example. So again, be very careful with any data that's given to you, and always question how it affects you. The most useful way that bigger data can do at farm level, and I would encourage you to get this information for yourself from your own data. Now this is Isle of Man, basically, because they actually require all calves to be tagged, including stillbirths and including late abortions. So that means actually the real life mortality data is true, as opposed to some of the data that we see. UK data will have missing data, so calves that have not been registered obviously don't show up on the cattle tracing system. So this does show the value of getting records on board, even if they die on day 0. It can really help you understand your problems. So this particular farmer was getting a 20% mortality, and the actual average for the Isle of Man was 6.2%. This is over the first 180 days of life. And what we understood from the farmer was that he was expanding his business and finishing all his own beef, but he actually hadn't, he probably hadn't really thought about where the business was going, just reducing his ewes and lambs and increasing his beef herd. He'd initiated an active vaccination program for IBR and Plants Act on BVD, but he had actually introduced IBR and BVD into the herd in the last 5 years. So there's probably interactions going on in there, and particularly with BVD in the herd, there could be influences on calf mortality. And what I was able to do with the data, having got the data from the Isle of Man government, was actually look over the last 3 years. So there's 2014, 15, and actually some of 2016, which you can't see here. Is we looked at the age of the dam, we looked at how many births she had, we looked at the sex of the calf, we looked at the bull, and we looked at the date of birth. Now, actually, if we look at Isle of Man data, there is an influence of sex of the calf. We do see that more male calves die in the first 180 days of life than female calves, and that is highly significant. And that reflects research that's been done. But as far as this particular farm was concerned, and this is where I say you've got to focus on the data for your farm when you're looking at bigger data. And I'm not calling this big data because big data now is massive, but it's bigger data than probably what you can count up on 10 fingers and 5 toes. This particular farm didn't have an effective sex of calf. He brought in some new bulls that he was worrying about. None of these had any effect. We looked through all of this information. He was basically just having big mortality issues. But also we had some lab results done, and they were suggesting that IBR was the problem and that these calves were IBR positive. But really the data and evidence didn't support the lab reports, and was this a red herring? And that's when we realised that the blood tests that were being taken and the timing of the blood tests were really not helping the potential diagnoses. So these calves were being blood sampled and tested for IBR, but of course you've just heard that the farm had started an IBR vaccination program, and these calves were actually getting a good dose of colostrum and actually had really good antibodies to IBR, not because they were being exposed to IBR, but because they were getting the colostral antibodies from their mothers. So this had caused a big red herring. And what we actually saw when we went round and looked around the farm and looked at what he was doing with expanding and finishing all his own beef, he hadn't actually increased the size of increased his shed capacity. And he was actually using his calving sheds through the winter. And actually, if he was late finishing his cattle, and again, I've got some data in the main report that shows a crossover between the age that his cattle were finishing and going to slaughter, kind of anything from, so that the cattle from the previous 18 months were going anything from the November through to January, February. And then he was starting calving in the January. And what he was doing was actually not having time to clean out the finishing sheds and making them into calving sheds. And he was basically not using proper hygiene to clean out those sheds. And this is what we believe is leading to 20% mortality. So all calves were exposed to infectious disease risk throughout the calving period, and that's why we couldn't show. Generally, if you're running a calving pattern that say starts in February and ends in April, and we see this particularly for dairy calves, we'll see an increase in mortality through that period just because of the build-up of diseased organisms. And if you keep using, you're doing lambing, again, you'll see that increase just because of the build-up of disease. This was a complete flat line across the board because actually the disease was already there at the time the first calves were being born in the January, February time. It's a very interesting case study and just shows that some fairly basic principles. It was nothing to do with colostrum in this case. It was really to do with hygiene management and the use of calving sheds as finishing sheds. So my recommendations, and I apologise for going on, make better use of your vets and specialists and recognise your limitations. Make better use of records. Use them in a positive way. And if you bring in bulls, you're not a closed herd. Don't bring in disease. Think biosecurity. Test and isolate any purchased stock, because actually this can have a massive input on both the productivity of your herd in your bulls and your cows, but also calf mortality. Don't keep animals with poor temperament. Defensive cows don't make good mothers. Calf records, we need more detail. Colostrum, plan ahead. Even if you've got occasional use, freeze colostrum rather than having to deal with possibly a single calving. You can't get colostrum from the cow, or the cow's stressed out. Make sure that you've got frozen colostrum available, and have some two-way communication between the farmer and vets, industry and government. Let's start making use of all this data that you're recording and actually giving you some feedback about what's happening on your own farm, because I don't think it's being used to its best ability. And I think think that would be the end of my talk.